Hi ladies, and welcome to the Civil War audio lecture. I feel like I needed a theme song. Next time. So to begin, take out your Civil Wars battle sheet, also your Supreme Court cases sheet. Both of those are also in your Unit 4 folder on Google Drive. Please keep careful track of all of your questions as I go through what we're going to discuss today, so I can get to any of your questions the first day back. So today we're going to be covering some more of the social side, the pros and cons, or the advantages and disadvantages of going into the war for each side, as well as more of the military aspects. So we left off with the fall of Fort Sumter, and after the fall of Fort Sumter, we're going to have 11 states that had seceded from the Union. We have the North fighting again for the preservation of the Union and upholding the Constitution as they saw it. And the South, not, of course, fighting for slavery per se, but the larger rights that were being threatened now or in the future by the North. So we're going to have some advantages and disadvantages. So I know we did some of this in class, but it never hurts to have a bit of a refresher. So we're going to have to mobilize our resources for war. The North, of course, had the most industrial and manufacturing capacity with 85% of factories on northern soil. The North also is going to have the majority of railroad lines, which is going to be key to interconnectedness and troop movement. We had 75% of the railroad lines. And the North is going to also have the largest amount of physical banks. So 75% of United States money is literally sitting right there in the North. And then, of course, the population advantage. But in 1861, there were 22 million Northerners versus 9 million Southerners, and approximately 4 million of those 9 million Southerners were slaves. So it's going to be then a huge population advantage for the North. The disadvantages of the North aren't quite so many. One, they're fighting the offensive, and which is always harder to do, and also that the rest of the world had nothing really to gain from a northern victory. In fact, it would have been ideal for England, France, for the North to have failed, so they wouldn't be able to manufacture the cotton coming from the South. The Southern cotton then would have gone directly back to England, which England was the world's #1 textile producer at the time. So there wasn't going to be a lot of eagerness to go in and fight the Civil War and help the North. The South is going to have a few advantages, not many. The first big one being that the South found its commanders early. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were both found in early of 1862. And we're going to have early success in many battles for the southern side. Honestly, if Lee and Jackson hadn't been the commanders that early, it's highly doubtful that the South really would have ever gained much momentum. The other advantage is that the South was fighting defensively. It's always easier to fight a defensive war. And they were fighting to protect their liberty. Now, the North also thinks that they're fighting to protect their liberty, so it's not going to be a huge advantage for the South, but this is why the South is going to call this the Second American Revolution. Also, they were really hopeful that England would come to their aid because England would want their cotton. However, after 1863 and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, that wasn't going to happen because in 1863, slavery finally is going to become one of the more moral issues of the war, and England had already outlawed slavery. Their disadvantages are huge. They're facing a richer, more populous industrial opponent, and it's a really hard time. It's not an easy job to get a new government organized and running while fighting a war. Remember, we talked about this in the American Revolution, but the South isn't going to be able to pull it off as we did that first time. So let's begin mobilizing our resources for war. Remember what the most basic things are: men and money. At first, raising men posed very little problem for either the North or the South because there were thousands of men who were volunteering to fight. In the early stages of the war, folks believed that the war was going to be short, so men on both sides were very high-spirited for their respective causes and rushed to go help out either side. Northerners rallied to Lincoln's call to preserve the Union. They remembered that Washington had told us in his farewell address that there would be no liberty without the Union. So, in order to preserve the Union, which guaranteed American freedom and liberty, Northern men by the thousands rushed to enlist. Southern men saw themselves also as fighting for their freedom and liberty, which would be secured, of course, by the South winning independence. So, ironically, both Northerners and Southerners saw themselves as fighting to preserve American liberty, one side by preserving the Union, the other side by leaving the Union. However, it became apparent after some months that the war was not going to be short, and then the casualty lists started getting longer, and when those lists started getting longer, enthusiasm for joining the army on either side started to wane. So, both sides started to offer cash bonuses that were also called bounties to induce men to join. The North also promised 160 acres of land to men who would join up. Now, this was a pretty good deal, assuming you survived the war, because as a young man, you wouldn't have to save up or take out a mortgage, and you'd have your little family farm, and all you'd need to add was the wife, 6 kids, a horse, pig, and a dog. Emphasis on the dog. Don't know why they didn't have any cats. Anyway, by 1862 to 1863, even bounties and other rewards weren't enough. So both the North and the South resorted, for the first time in American history, to compulsory military service. This is also called conscription, better known as the draft. Both the North and the South are going to use the draft despite its unpopularity. It was unpopular for a few reasons. There seemed to be something European and kind of un-American about the government forcing people into the army. Also, you know how you rarely get something right the first time you try it? The same thing here for the draft on both sides. In both the North and the South, the wealthier people had ways to get out of the draft, where the poorer people did not. In the North, a guy had to be a guy. We didn't have women fighting in the war, and we've never actually had a draft that included women. Anyway, a guy could do a couple of things if he was drafted. He could hire a substitute. You're thinking, who would allow himself to be hired and then maybe get killed? How many poor starving Irish immigrants did you say there were? Yeah, it was those people. If you got a nice chunk of cash by taking another guy's place, then you could take good care of your family. Also, by the later stages of the war, even a private in the Union Army made $16 a month, plus you got free uniforms, food, and shelter. $16 a month was actually good money in those days, so you could see how someone actually might be willing to allow himself to be hired as a draft substitute. Also in the North, if you got drafted, you could buy your way out. This was the government's way of raising more money. You'd be drafted, and if you can't find a substitute, no problem, just give $300 to the government, and that's it. In the South, where manpower was much scarcer, getting enough soldiers proved to be a real problem. Sorry about that. Proved to be a real problem. As in the North, despite various inducements, the Confederates also needed a draft. The draft in the Confederacy also fell more heavily on the lower classes. As in the North, a drafted Southerner with other plans could hire a substitute or simply pay the government a large sum of money, and that was that. In addition, because of the eternal fear of slave rebellion, those who owned a fair number of slaves had automatic exemptions. The number of slaves needed for exemption was at first 15, later 20, and then, as we've seen, if you already owned even one slave, you were in the upper 25% of Southern society. And if so, that means if you had 15 or 20 slaves, you were really rich. So these laws are going to cause substantial resentment. Poor non-slave-holding Southerners bitterly and angry referred to these slave owner exemption laws as the 15 N-word laws, and the 20 N-word laws. Okay, they actually use the word, but I know it's an offensive language, but of course sometimes you have to simply know what people said, and our recognition of a historical usage does not constitute approval of such usage. So obviously in the North and the South, someone in the upper middle class or upper classes could get out of the draft, but poor people could not, and this is going to cause resentment. In fact, in New York City in July of 1863, there was a massive anti-draft riot that went on for days and resulted in hundreds of deaths and injuries, and the riot was finally suppressed by thousands of Union soldiers. Now, luckily, about 90% of all soldiers in the Civil War on both sides were veterans, so the inequalities of the draft were somewhat less than they could have been. However, when the U.S. next used the draft in World War I, men could not hire substitutes or buy their way out, and obviously there's no exemption for slaveholders by then. So let us remember also that the North possessed the great advantages in the immigrants and free blacks. Even during 4 years of the war, nearly 1 million more immigrants poured into the North, so the hundreds of thousands of Irish, Germans, and so on who had fought for the North provided this enormous advantage. Similarly, starting in 1863, the Union Army accepted African Americans, and approximately 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. About 38,000 died. Unfortunately, these African Americans had to serve in racially segregated units, often led by white officers. That's what it says there in the bottom of my slide. I don't know if that cut off or not. Anyway, white and black Americans would not serve together in an integrated U.S. Army until President Harry Truman ordered it in 1948. That is after World War II. About 70,000 more African Americans served in the Navy or worked for the federal government in other capacities, however, so the advantages of population boosted by immigrants and African Americans helped carry the North to victory. So in raising money, both sides faced the same challenges, although the North had substantial advantages, as we noted. Basically, any government at any time can get more money for itself in only 3 ways: raise taxes, borrow money, or just print money. I'm going to go through each one of these methods and their risks. So, starting up top, the raise taxes. Americans, as you know, have never been much of a fan of taxation. Borrowing money, which comes through issuing and selling bonds, has always been more acceptable to Americans, but since the government has to pay interest on bonds and the interest rate has to be competitive, costs in the long run can be astronomical. Printing money is the easiest way to do it, but this vastly increases the money supply, which then causes inflation, which causes the value of money to decline. This can cause the government to just keep printing more, which only makes inflation worse and is an endless spiral. So as we're going to see, the North and the South used all of these methods with different degrees of success. So although it was prohibited by the Constitution at this time, the North imposed income taxes on individual Americans for the first time in U.S. history. And once the war was over, the courts did declare income taxes unconstitutional. In the North and the South, taxes of all sorts increased, but as always, most of the revenue on both sides came from selling bonds. Even in the wartime, Americans don't like taxes to get too high, but were usually willing to buy bonds to finance a war, as though this is going to be the more popular way to go. Last but not least, both sides are going to print paper money, which are also known as greenbacks in the North due to the green ink. That's why today our money is often referred to as a greenback. Printing money is going to cause inflation in both the North and the South, and it is going to be far worse in the South. Over the 4 years of the war, inflation was about 80% in the North, meaning something that cost $1 in 1861 would cost $1.80 in 1865. That is fairly serious inflation, given that in the 1990s, inflation was at about 20 to 25% over the course of 10 years. However, even 80% is not too bad given the North's economy. In the South, where they printed $1 billion of paper currency, inflation from 1861 to 1865 was 9,000%. That is not a typo. That is not one of my little bonehead mistakes. No, you read that right. You heard that right. 9,000%. So a loaf of bread would cost $25 in the South by the end of the war. So as you can see, the money situation in the South is going to harm their war effort. So to conclude on production, while the North has some unhappy men drafted in the Army, and while the draft had some unfairness, most soldiers volunteered, 90%, and this was also the case for Southerners. The big Northern advantage, of course, came in the sheer numbers for, as noted, the North, with the manpower advantage of a little over 4-to-1. Financially, the North's advantage proved even more substantial, and while inflation became a little bit of a problem in the North, it was a disaster in the South, and it weakened the Confederacy considerably. And of course, as we've already talked about, the North's great advantage in factories and manufacturing allowed the North to produce virtually unlimited amount of war material, from uniforms and shoes to cannons and rifles and railroad equipment. The South, of course, struggled. One question you might ask is, did everyone in both sections support the goal of their section? Or, in other words, did all Northerners support what Lincoln was trying to do, and did all Southerners support what Davis and the Confederates were trying to do? Well, as you know, Americans hardly ever agree on all things. I think it's one of our rights. Most Northerners are going to support the goal of preserving and restoring the Union, but not all of them are going to agree. The Democratic Party, for example, was split. War Democrats, like Stephen A. Douglas, supported the war, but peace Democrats did not, and they wanted to stop the war. These peace Democrats became known in the North as Copperheads, which is a poisonous snake native to the United States, so you can see how they were viewed. Nonetheless, especially in the first years of the war, when the North was losing frequently, the appeal of the Copperheads to stop the war did attract some Northerners. We also have to remember that some of the border states were rather reluctant to stay in the Union. As we're going to talk about a little bit more, Lincoln basically kept Maryland and the Union at gunpoint, and at least 1/3 of the population in Kentucky favored the Confederacy, which Lincoln's own in-laws in Kentucky, by the way, all joined the Confederate forces, and Missouri was never entirely happy as part of the Union, so things could have gotten ugly in all of those states. Lincoln is actually going to keep things under control by playing a bit free and loose with the Constitution. He is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and had about 10,000, yes, 10,000 of his most outspoken critics thrown into jail and held indefinitely so they could not cause trouble. In other areas, civilians are going to stand trial in military courts for opposing the war. Lincoln observed that he had to bend the Constitution a bit in order to preserve it. What's interesting here is that there was no attempt actually to interfere with elections. The congressional election of 1862 went on as scheduled in the North, as did the presidential election of 1864, which for a while there looked like Lincoln would lose. So, therefore, while Lincoln took on exceptional powers, he did indeed bend, quote-unquote, the Constitution. In light of the circumstances, things could have been much. In the South, not everyone supported secession. Some Southerners remained pro-Union and refused to support the Confederacy, although they did form a pretty tiny minority, probably under 2%. The most pro-Union and anti-Confederate areas of the South tended to be in the Appalachian Mountains, where the poor whites of West Virginia, Western North Carolina, and Eastern Tennessee tended to see the war as a war for slavery, which of course it was not, but Americans could oversimplify back then as easy as they can now. So, the Confederates had a hard time maintaining order in those areas, and it generally wasn't too safe for them to go up there to collect taxes or enforce the draft. In Western Virginia, things got so bad that the people opposed the secession of Virginia, so that they and the people then in what became West Virginia, these small counties, separated from West Virginia. So Virginia left the Union, then several dozen western counties of Virginia separated from Virginia and clung to the Union. In 1863, this western area was admitted to the Union as the state of West Virginia. There was a little bit of controversy over the constitutionality of it, and it took actually until the 1920s for the Supreme Court to sort it all out, but West Virginia remains a separate state now. So obviously, there was some resistance to the war in both the North and the South, but the majority of people in both sections supported their section's causes. However, in both the Union and the Confederate armies, you could find regiments from Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, so that shows divisions. Put it this way, you couldn't find any Pennsylvania or New York regiments in the Confederate Army, and you couldn't find any white Georgia or Texas regiments in the Union Army, but you could find Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland regiments on both sides, so the war truly was brother versus brother in those states. Families literally split, with some fighting in the North and some fighting for the South. In fact, there are stories, known cases of brothers capturing or fighting each other on various battlefields of the war. So it's these border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, which caused the biggest headache for Lincoln in many ways. Not only were they the group, the cluster of states with the strongest internal divisions, but they also tended to be good manufacturing states, especially Missouri. So it was very important to keep them part of the Union, as well as it was key to keep Maryland part of the Union, because as you see there, Washington, D.C. sits right smack dab on the Potomac, Maryland on one side, Virginia on the other. You can't exactly have the nation's capital in the Confederacy. So what Lincoln did were two very controversial moves having to do with the writ of habeas corpus and martial law. So the writ of habeas corpus, as you guys know, it's the right to know your charges, otherwise you have to be released. And martial law, which is basically a military government. This is when the military goes in, takes over the local government, and usually includes suspension of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So Lincoln says that he has to save the Constitution, in order to save the Constitution, he has to break the Constitution, and he has to keep those border states. So he starts first by suspending the writ of habeas corpus in just the border states, and then in 1862 imposed martial law on the entire nation. So in other words, everyone is going to have some suspensions. In 1861, it went to the Supreme Court, and the ruling of Taney's Supreme Court said actually only Congress had the right to suspend habeas corpus. But in 1863, Congress retroactively approved Lincoln's suspension. And then after the war, we're going to get another one of these cases called Ex parte Milligan in 1866, saying that martial law may not be applied to civilians in areas where there is no insurrection and where civilian courts are still open. So please right now go to your Supreme Court's case sheet and take a careful, close look at these cases. Write down any questions that you may have. So this is really Lincoln's darker legacy. This is the question of, was this his big bonehead mistake? So was he right to impose martial law? Was he right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus? So I'd like you guys right now to open up this article on Lincoln, read it, and answer the questions. It can be very brief. Hang on to this for when we return, and we're going to talk about it the first day back. Please do not upload it to Canvas. I will check homework in class instead. So with the mobilization of so many men, Northern and Southern women picked up the slack, taking up much of the farm work in both areas. Remember, most Americans, North and South, were mostly farmers at this time. And also, at this time, women are going to become nurses in both the North and the South. Up until this time, it was quote-unquote improper for women to serve as nurses because nurses have to touch their patients. Scandal! However, Northern women such as Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, remember her, Dorothea Dix, remember her, and Clara Barton, are going to point out that women could do the nursing and that would free up more men to fight, and that ended up being a very persuasive argument. Southern women made the same argument, and therefore during the Civil War, nursing is going to become an acceptable quote-unquote career for women. Today, as you know, nursing does remain a female-dominated profession, although of course male nurses become more common all the time. The fact, though, that women are going to become nurses was a step forward for women and women's rights. Although it did come in an unusual way, nobody was like, let's have women become nurses because this will allow women to make it in another profession and this will advance our cause after the war. So even though nobody said that, this was nonetheless the effect. Wars always disrupt the social fabric, and disruption can bring change. So this is a good example of that. So, to conclude, we can see how the two sides compared when the war began and some of what had to be done to fight the war. The North's advantages proved decisive in the long run, but we know things could have turned out differently. Of course, there was no guarantee of victory just because the North had so many advantages. Remember, the British seemed to have all the advantages before the American Revolution, but they didn't win, and the same thing could have happened in the Civil War. There was no denying, though, that the war required an unprecedented amount of mobilization in American manpower and women power and resources on both sides. There will also be some Northerners who had some unhappy men drafted into the Army, and while the draft did have some unfairness, most soldiers volunteered, and this is the case for Southerners too. The big Northern advantage, of course, came in sheer numbers, as noted. The North had that manpower advantage of a little over 4-to-1. The vast majority of people in both sections supported their sections. However, in both the Union and the Confederate armies, you could still find regiments from Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, showing that brother versus brother mentality. The attitude on both sides then, in the beginning of the war, was that one battle would end the entire war. Both sides were extremely confident for victory. The first battle is going to take place July of 1861. This is called the First Battle of Manassas, or the First Battle of Bull Run. Most battles have two names. The Confederates had moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, and we thought that if we just grabbed Richmond, we would win. Basically, we had two very badly trained armies going to fight each other, and the South actually wins this battle. It's actually in some ways a good thing that the North lost because we learned a lot more from losing. The South thinks, though, that they are the best. The North decided to rethink their tactics, and they decided that they needed a plan. They needed a plan for a really long struggle. In fact, our struggle is going to be long, and it's going to be very broad. The farthest western battle was in Arizona. The Union General-in-Chief at that time was Winfield Scott, and he proposed the Anaconda Plan. This was to seize control of the Mississippi Valley and the Mississippi River and then squeeze control of the South. Just like an anaconda snake, they would squeeze the South and basically bleed it dry. The advantage was that the South had most of the rivers that ran along the North and the South. So they had the Mississippi, and the North was using steamships. The technology, though, in the North was good, and we're going to have armored warships, and the railroads are going to be critical, all of which is going to work in our advantage of splitting the South and having a Northern advantage. However, even though the North had this plan, this Anaconda Plan, it was going to take time for us to organize our advantages. And For instance, we had the leader, McClellan. George McClellan was the head general, who was a really kind of cocky jerk who treated Lincoln very disrespectfully. But Lincoln decided, hey, I'm going to let it go because I've got to win the war. But it was those little things like that that are going to set the North back a bit. Also, the fact that we were going up against Robert E. Lee is not going to make it easy. So Ulysses S. Grant is actually going to start to get some attention in 1862, and at the same time Lee is going to launch his first assault in the North. Robert E. Lee actually decided that the South had to win an offensive battle on Northern territory. He understood that a big battle win he was seeing this now as a foreign territory would look really good, and maybe it would help the South get some outside help. He's thinking of it like maybe it's like the Battle of Saratoga in the Revolution. So Lee is going to invade Maryland in 1862. In the North, this is going to actually be a big break for us. Lee's secret plan was actually discovered by Union troops and then given to McClellan, who was an idiot and not a very good battlefield general. It was his golden opportunity to strike at Lee, and it really could have shortened the war, but McClellan was overly cautious and completely paralyzed. September 17, 1862, the two armies came together at Antietam Creek, which ran through the battlefield. It was a one-day battle, and it was fought with over 100,000 troops on each side. It was the bloodiest day of the Civil War, where we're going to have the Union 12,500 casualties versus the Confederate 13,700 casualties. Very bloody, and the bodies were very thick. That's actually a photo from the Battle of Antietam. Photography was just getting started back then. This was actually a small defeat for the South. Lee retreated back into Virginia, and the Union claimed it as a victory, although it could have been a much bigger victory. Lincoln now began to move towards the Emancipation Proclamation. He had been avoiding slavery as an issue, but Lincoln was hoping that something would happen that would end up freeing the slaves. Lincoln was reluctant to do anything about slavery, so it wouldn't look like a desperate move so he needed a Union victory. And after this battle, Lincoln will issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that would go into effect January 1st, 1863. So I'd like you guys to take a minute and watch this brief history of the Battle of Antietam, and we're going to pick up there in class when we return. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for listening. See you soon.